The night the town decided she was worthless, the wind howled through the wooden streets of Silver Hollow like a living thing, rattling the saloon windows and carrying the smell of whiskey, dust, and despair. And inside the crowded bar, her father stood swaying on his boots, his breath sour with liquor, his eyes glassy as he raised his bottle and shouted to anyone who would listen that his daughter was deaf and useless, and that whoever wanted her could take her because she wasn't worth feeding anymore. And the laughter that followed cut through the air, sharper than any knife. But in the corner near the fireplace sat a tall, broad-shouldered mountain man with a beard touched by grey and eyes that had seen too many winters. And he didn't laugh, he didn't drink. He just watched the trembling girl standing beside her father, her dark hair tied back, her hands folded tight like she was holding the world together. And though everyone believed she couldn't hear a word, she felt every vibration of cruelty in that room, like thunder in her bones. And when her father shoved her forward toward a group of miners who were jeering and reaching for her, the mountain man rose slowly, boots heavy on the wooden floor, and walked toward her with a quietness that silenced even the drunken crowd. And when he stood in front of her, he bent down so only she could see his lips and whispered softly, "I know you can hear more than they think." And her eyes widened, because no one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever believed she was anything more than a burden. And outside, the storm carried the sound of something changing forever. Her name was Eliza, though most people in town just called her the deaf girl, and she had grown up in silence, or what others thought was silence, but to her the world was a quilt of vibrations, of distant echoes, of subtle sounds she learned to read through the ground, the walls, the movement of lips and hands. And though she had lost most of her hearing, as a child after a fever nearly killed her, she still heard whispers, low tones, the rumble of thunder, and sometimes even voices if they were close enough. But her father never cared to learn how she experienced the world. He only cared that she was different, and difference in the frontier was weakness, and weakness was something cruel men despised. And so, when his mining job failed and his drinking took over, he decided she was one more thing to get rid of, like an old mule or a broken rifle. The mountain man's name was Caleb Stone, a trapper and wanderer who lived between the peaks where the snow never fully melted and the trees whispered ancient secrets, and he had lost his own family years ago to a river flood. So when he saw Eliza's fear, something in him broke open like ice in spring, and without asking permission, he placed a heavy coin on the bar, took her hand gently, and led her outside while the drunk father laughed and told the crowd to enjoy their prize never, realizing he had just given away the only soul who ever cared if he lived or died. Caleb didn't take her to a cabin full of men or a place of laughter and cruelty. He took her to his pack horse, lifted her onto the saddle with care, and wrapped his coat around her shoulders. And though she couldn't hear everything he said, she saw his lips forming words slowly. Carefully, you're safe. And those two words meant more to her than anything she had ever known. And as they rode out of Silver Hollow, the lanterns faded behind them, and the mountains swallowed them whole. And for the first time in her life, she felt like the world was opening instead of closing. The journey to Caleb's mountain cabin took 2 days, through forests where the trees stood like silent guardians and rivers that shimmered like silver under the moonlight. And along the way, he showed her how to read the land, how to feel the ground for approaching horses, how to watch the birds for signs of storms, and how to communicate with simple hand signs. He had learned trading with native tribes, and Eliza learned fast, her eyes bright with curiosity, her hands quick to copy his movements. And though words were hard, understanding between them came easy, like they had both been waiting for someone who spoke in more than just sound. But Silver Hollow was not done with her. When Eliza's father woke up sober enough to realize what he had done, he saw the empty bed and felt something that was not quite love and not quite regret, but more like anger that something that belonged to him was gone. And when he heard that a mountain man had taken her, He told himself a story that made him feel better, that she had been stolen, that she was his property, and that he would get paid to bring her back. And so he gathered a few rough men who thought a deaf girl would be easy money, and they rode into the mountains with rifles and ropes, laughing about what they would do when they found her. Meanwhile, Eliza began to bloom in the mountain quiet, learning to cook, to trap rabbits, to ride alone, to read Caleb's journal where he wrote about the land. And though she still felt the ache of being unwanted, it started to fade, replaced by a strange, new feeling, belonging, and sometimes at night she would sit by the fire and touch the scars on Caleb's hands, and he would look at her and smile in a way that told her she was not broken, not a burden, not a thing to be traded, but a human being who mattered. But one evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks and the sky burned red like warning fire, Eliza felt something through the ground, a rhythm, heavy and unnatural, like thunder with purpose, and she turned to Caleb and tried to sign, but fear made her hands shake. And when he knelt and pressed his ear to the earth, his face grew dark because he knew the sound of riders, and he knew they were coming for her. And as the shadows stretched long and the wind carried the distant echo of men who believed power was louder, then kindness, Caleb placed a rifle in her hands, looked into her eyes, and whispered slowly so she could read his lips. "They think you're weak. They're wrong." The night pressed down on the mountain like a heavy blanket, and the fire outside Caleb's cabin crackled low, as if it too sensed danger. And Eliza sat beside him with the rifle resting in her trembling hands, while the wind carried the smell of pine, and snow and distant sweat and smoke from men who believed they owned everything they could chase. And though she could not hear their laughter clearly, she felt it in the vibration of the ground, in the way the birds fled the trees, in the way the horses snorted and stomped in the darkness. And Caleb watched her closely, speaking slow and steady so she could read his lips, telling her that fear was natural, but surrender was a choice. And she nodded, gripping the rifle tighter, because, for the first time in her life, she did not want to be taken, traded, or thrown away again. The riders reached the clearing just after midnight, lanterns swinging like angry stars in the dark, and Eliza recognized her father immediately. His shoulders slumped, his hat crooked, his anger burning brighter than the lantern light, and he dismounted with a stumble, shouting words she could not hear, but could easily read from his lips, calling her property, calling her ungrateful, calling Caleb a thief, and the men with him laughed, already imagining the reward they would get for dragging her back. And Caleb stepped out of the cabin with calm, his rifle resting across his arms, his eyes steady as mountain stone, and he told them in a voice that carried authority even to those who thought kindness was weakness, that she was not going anywhere, and that any man who tried to take her would leave the mountain in a coffin or not at all. Her father stepped forward, swaying, pointing a shaking finger at Caleb, telling him that the girl was his, and that no wild mountain hermit had the right to keep her. And Eliza watched his lips move, her heart tightening, because she had spent her whole life hoping that one day he would look at her the way Caleb did. But instead he looked at her like a sack of coal to be sold, and in that moment something inside her hardened, and she stepped forward, lifting the rifle, her hands no longer shaking. And though her father thought she was too deaf and too scared to fight, he froze when he saw her eyes, because they were no longer the eyes of a frightened child, but the eyes of a woman who knew her worth. The men laughed at first until a shot rang out, echoing through the valley, and a bullet struck the dirt inches from one man's boot, sending dust into the air like a warning, and silence fell heavy. And Caleb didn't move, didn't shout, didn't threaten, he just watched, because he knew this was her moment. And Eliza spoke, not with her voice, but with her hands and her posture, and the rifle in her grasp, showing them that deaf did not mean helpless, that quiet did not mean weak. And her father stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a burden, but as a force he could not control. But anger is louder than shame in broken men. And her father lunged forward, reaching for her, shouting words she could not fully hear but could read on his lips. Words about money, about pride, about how he would drag her back even if he had to break her arms. And in that moment, Caleb moved faster than a mountain storm, stepping between them, knocking the man to the ground, and holding him there with a strength that came, not from hatred but from years of carrying grief. And he told him that being a father was not ownership, that giving life did not give the right to destroy it, and that if he ever tried to sell his daughter again, he would answer not to the law, but to the mountain. The other men, seeing that this was no easy prize, backed away, their courage fading as fast as the lantern light, and one by one they mounted their horses and left, leaving Eliza's father kneeling in the dirt, his anger drained, his shame finally heavy enough to feel. And Eliza stepped toward him, her heart pounding, and though she could not hear his apology clearly, she saw his lips form words she had never seen before. "I'm sorry," and though she knew those words could not erase years of neglect, they were still something, and she placed her hand on his shoulder, not in forgiveness, not in hatred, but in farewell. Because some people do not deserve your life, but they deserve your mercy. And then she turned away and walked back to the cabin with Caleb, not looking back. The seasons changed after that. Snow covering the mountains, then melting into wildflowers. And Eliza grew into her new life like a tree finding sunlight after years in shadow, learning to read and write, learning to trade with nearby settlements, teaching children simple hand signs so they could speak to her, and slowly, word spread about the deaf girl in the mountains who was smarter, braver and kinder than most men in town, and travelers came to see her not as a curiosity, but as a person who had carved her place in a world that tried to erase her. Caleb watched her with quiet pride, never claiming her as property, never calling her his, but always standing beside her. And one day, as they sat on a cliff overlooking the valley, the sun painting the sky gold, he took her hand and asked, slowly, carefully, so she could understand, if she wanted to stay, not as a rescued girl, but as a partner, as family, as something chosen and not forced. And Eliza smiled, tears in her eyes, and nodded. Because for the first time, she was not being taken, she was choosing. Years later, when Silver Hollow told stories about the mountain woman who couldn't hear but could see the truth better than anyone, they spoke with respect, and sometimes with awe, and her father, now sober and quieter, would sit in the corner of the saloon and tell anyone who would listen that his daughter was the bravest person he had ever known. And though he never fully healed the past, he learned that love is not shouted in drunken bars, but whispered in actions that say, "You are safe." And Eliza, standing on the mountain beside Caleb, listening to the world in her own way, feeling the ground, watching the sky, reading lips and reading hearts, understood something that many people never learn, that silence does not mean emptiness, that difference does not mean weakness, and that sometimes the quietest people hear the loudest truths. Moral lesson: true strength is not in loud voices, power or ownership. It is in kindness, respect, and recognizing the worth of every human being, no matter their abilities or disabilities. Those society calls weak may carry the deepest courage, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who simply see others as human,